LiUNA is part of our union family here in Alberta, and Rose was one of our union sisters. She was a mother, a friend, a healthcare worker, and as we've heard, she was also a union activist and a shop steward. So I'm here today on behalf of all of Rose's sisters and brothers in the Alberta labor movement to celebrate her life and to mourn her loss. As Alberta union activists, our first concern is for Rose, her family, her friends, and her co-workers. From our perspective, Rose is a frontline hero who is gone far too soon. But our sadness for Rose turns to anger when we think of the role that the provincial government played in her death. The Kenney government failed Rose and other healthcare workers like her by failing to properly implement a single site policy for continuing care facilities, by failing to enact paid sick leave laws and other policies that would have allowed workers to stay home when they need to isolate, and by failing to reduce the growth and the community spread of COVID, making it much, much more difficult to keep residents and staff in continuing care facilities like Summerwood safe. The government's approach of doing as little as possible, as late as possible, was a disaster for Rose, and it's been a disaster for our whole province. We think it is no exaggeration to say that Premier Kenney and Health Minister Shandro have blood on their hands. How bad have things been in seniors facilities around Alberta? Well, All Seniors Care, the company that owns Summerwood Village, where Rose worked, they operate 8 facilities in Alberta, 6 in Edmonton and region, and 2 in Calgary. All but one of those facilities have had outbreaks, sometimes multiple outbreaks, and in some cases, very large outbreaks. So sadly, this is not unusual for the sector. Rose was the fourth healthcare worker to die of COVID in the last week and a half, and she was one of 139 Albertans who died from the virus in this last week alone, making it the most deadly week in Alberta since the pandemic began. We can't bring Rose back, but we can take action to limit future deaths. That's why, as of today, and in Rose's memory, the Alberta Federation of Labor and our affiliated unions will be ramping up our efforts to demand isolation pay from the provincial government for all workers who have to isolate because of COVID. And in the next session of the legislature, we will be demanding that the government pass a law mandating 10 days of paid sick leave for all Albertans. We have said goodbye to far too many of our friends and colleagues who have died as a result of workplace exposure to COVID, and we know that more will die in the coming weeks. These deaths are doubly tragic because many of them could have been and should have been avoided if workers simply could afford to stay home when they needed to. Appeals to personal responsibility are empty and hollow and ineffective when low-income workers have to choose between following health guidelines and paying their rent or putting food on their tables. The bottom line for us is that if the Kenney government is serious about stopping the spread of COVID, then they need to get serious about isolation pay and paid sick leave. To date, they have not been serious about either of those things. That needs to change. So in Rose's memory, and for the sake of all Albertans, let's make sure that it does. Thank you.